If you don't want to be the entrepreneur and you have a brilliant idea and it stays only in your head or in a patent or in an article, that doesn't guarantee that it's going to be used by society. And I think that we have a moral mission that if we have learned something with taxpayers' money and it only stays in the academic records, who is going to bring that knowledge to society? Sometimes companies don't even know of the existence of brilliant Professor X that made a discovery.
Hello and welcome to SciLax, the podcast for people who love science and for those ones who don't yet know that they do. And I'm sure that once again today with this episode, we will convince a lot of people that they love science because it's going to be so interesting. I can't wait to talk to Professor David Fernández Rivas. And who is he? David is a professor at University of Twente and his research focuses on the interface of physics, chemistry and bioengineering and a lot of different things that we will delve into. I hope, David, thank you so much for coming today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I love definitions. I think science has to define things first before we kind of go deep. So first of all, probably easy question, but difficult answer. Who is an engineer for you?
That's a question that many people have tried to answer. And one of the conclusions I came with and I tried to apply is an engineer is an individual that is looking for solutions to problems. And these problems could be practical, but could also be trying to give an answer to a fundamental question. Typically, it's not stopping at finding just the answer, but building something and then transferring that knowledge. Is, in my view, somebody who's making a change to something that exists or combine things together and then a new solution or a new technology emerges.
So what you're saying basically makes me think that we should all be engineers.
In principle, nothing stops you from being an engineer. You don't need a paper degree from a university. Of course, legally, you might need it. But to act as an engineer and to discover things and to learn new things and work with other people, you can be an engineer with my definition.
Yeah, exactly. I love that definition also because it really very much makes me think of applications, right? And as much as I support fundamental science, sometimes it's very difficult to communicate about it because it's very far from application. Whereas what you're saying here is you all the time think of solving problems.
Yeah, and it's not exclusive. I know very good colleagues that are fundamental scientists as training. So they receive a degree in physics, particle physics, or fundamental physics branches, or chemistry. And there are two possibilities. They are very good communicating with the more practical-oriented colleagues, or they become themselves engineer in my definition. So nobody stops you at the border. You can, jump for a few years and work with biologists or with chemists. And that's how I like to see an engineering work as a collective team effort, where the borders are typically to help you categorize knowledge or understanding, but not to stop individuals from entering new fields.
But it also eventually means that there has to be interdisciplinarity to solve the problems. Can you just stay deep in one field?
I think it's a personal choice. And depending on your environment, you might have the luxury to become an expert in one discipline and stay there for your whole professional career. My understanding is that nowadays it's very difficult to contribute to the huge body of knowledge that humans have produced over centuries without becoming a polymath yourself, or at least collaborating with other colleagues from different fields. Because the complexity of the problems we're trying to tackle nowadays demand, by definition, multi or interdisciplinarity.
We will move on to applications in a second, but staying in the science part, if you go to a conference, actually, what kind of conferences, scientific conferences do you go to? Because if you get interdisciplinary approach, then there's a lot to choose from, no?
True. In the last few years, I typically promote my PhD students or people from my team to go to conferences because I think they learn a lot more being out there. I have had a good share of traveling. And also I have a young family, so I prefer sometimes to be together with the family instead of traveling. But I enjoy talking to chemical engineering communities. And then, of course, the flavor or the angle is slightly different. The funny thing is that my slides don't change if I present it into a more physics or biomedical community. I just select the order of slides different or explain verbally different aspects, but my slides themselves don't change much because I try always to synthesize the knowledge to something that can be understood by almost all disciplines in science.
That is very interesting, right? Because, of course, I did talk, for example, to someone who was an expert in chemistry and then crossed the borders, let's say, to be a theoretical physicist. And I did hear comments about his work where it was, he is too much like a chemist, right? So there's always that problem as well. It's when you start crossing, of course, you might be too much of a thing for one side and not enough on the other side, right?
That's true. And I think it's a risk we need to accept and acknowledge and improve. Because if one conference, the first conference you give in a new field, of course, there might be some elements you don't know the full story, and you might mix terminology or make some mistakes, but we learn by mistakes. The worst is if you, by fear of saying something wrong, don't go to that conference where you're going to probably find the next team of collaborators that can bring you to a new discovery.
What you're saying actually eventually also leads to one of the important words that you talk about a lot, and you even wrote a book about it, which is empathy. I see actually empathy applied here as well at conferences, just listening to other people and actually trying to be in the field while learning from them.
Indeed, I think for me, empathy is crucial because no matter how much I learn about something, you put under stress the audience if you talk from a position of authority and don't manage to bring them along in the journey. So for me, the empathy works in different ways. It's not only about the team around me, working with me, the students I supervise, but it's also about why we're doing the work we are executing. Is it going to solve a problem for patients? Is it going to be used by other scientific fields? Empathy is the motivation to make sure that the message comes across. And this typical image that people have is like putting in somebody else's shoes. Sounds a bit silly, but it's an exercise that no matter how difficult it is important. And I believe we all should be trying to do.
We'll go back to this a little bit later, but first of all, two terms that I would not like to avoid. And one of the first terms is microfluidics, because you do quite a lot of work in that field. What actually is it, microfluidics?
Yeah, microfluidics, when you look at the word and you split it in two, so the fluidic part typically is easy to explain because it has to do with water and air. So those are the classical fluids. And the micro part is very small, like microscope is used to study small objects and small phenomena. So microfluidics is typically defined as the field in which you study the fundamental phenomena happening at the micro scale. So it's typically 10 to the power of -6. So it's a bit smaller than a millimeter. In my case, since the field is relatively maturing at the moment, I think for more than 30 years, the field has grown in importance and relevance. And now I'm mostly interested in the applications or some of the microfluidics phenomena, which have developed in parallel with microelectronics. Why this is important is that all the technologies we use to make microfluidic chips is almost the same as we use to make the microchips in our computers and telephones.
Microfluidic chips. You sound as if I should know this, but I kind of am lost already.
So the electronic chips that you have in your phone or in your laptop typically are made in clean rooms with very advanced fabrication technologies where you can have atom by atom deposition, or you can subtract very defined layers of substances from a material. The microelectronics, for example, most people are familiar because it's in the chips of the computers. Now for all these AI farms, you need faster chips, faster computers. So all those are called microelectronic chips. Now, microfluidic chips, instead of moving around electrons, we're moving fluid. So that you could see as an analogy with microfluidics is studying and manipulating the movement of fluids at a small scale.
Okay. Makes sense. Thank you so much. But actually, I was also thinking about the scale, because recently, a couple of months ago, I had an expert in nanomaterials and was wondering, here we have micro scale. So how does it happen? Like if you get to the nano, you're like, oh no, that's not us. It's too small. Or like, where do you draw the line?
I think that it's very difficult to draw a line from a physics point of view. It's like in light, you don't have like just white and black unless you have a very good filter. Typically, you see signs in a spectrum, and in scale, you might have kilometers, meters, micrometers, nanometers are, at the smallest end, let's say at the molecular level. But depending on the phenomenon you're studying, the border between the fields becomes more diffuse. Then what that means is that if I'm looking at a phenomenon where influences from the atomic scale are important, I definitely should be looking a bit more in the nano elements. But if I'm looking more towards larger scales, then my focus goes into the more tangible physical world for us with our fingers. Then humans are fond to put, nano, like similar to physicists, chemists, and doctors or whatever. The same applies here. We need those definitions to give us a ballpark indication of where is our main focus, but we cannot ignore what happens at a lower or a larger scale, because there might be influencing factors that we need to consider.
And of course, also macro scale in that case too, right? It's not that you're only interested in the micro.
Yeah, that's why sometimes, depending on the circumstances, I define the mesoscale, where you have an overlap of the nano, the micro, and even the human daily life scale. And of course, you can keep expanding it. But there are some phenomena that work very well at large scale that you will never see in the small scale, and the other way around. So electrons typically are not affected by gravity, and the other way around. If you are looking at the movement of oceans or the atmosphere, the contribution of one electron is negligible. So this is why these fields help sometimes to give you a definition of where exactly you are looking at. But we should always be alert of what happens in the surrounding fields.
Yeah, that is a very interesting point. It also leads me to a discussion I had about the idea of emergence in physics, So then even more, right? The systems thinking of different constituents, let's say, that is important too, and we don't know so much about. But going back, so microfluidics, I get it. You said fluids, but then one of the things you look at are bubbles. But bubbles are not fluids, or are they?
That's an interesting question. Depending on what type of bubbles you are referring to, most children and adults are familiar with soap bubbles. Typically there you have a little membrane and gas inside. So when you're blowing a soapy film, then you create these nice friendly bubbles. The bubbles I'm typically looking at are surrounded by a liquid. So inside you might have a vapor, could be air, could be a gas, and then why it's interesting is that bubbles can happen inside a liquid. So imagine when you open a carbonated drink, like water with gas or cola or beer, you sometimes see some bubbles rising up. So these bubbles are already in the liquid. When they get to the interface, sometimes they pop up. But there's also another interesting aspect of bubbles is that when they are at an interface of solid and liquid, some interesting phenomena happen there. Before the bubble appears, when it grows and when it detaches. At that interface, when you have solid, liquid, gas interface, some interesting phenomena happen, and it can influence several activities like electrochemistry, heat transfer, mass reactions, or chemical reactions. So that's why I'm very interested in bubbles at the micro scale.
And the term here would be cavitation. This is also a new term for me.
Yes, cavitation, depending on the field, is defined slightly differently. In some cases, people define it as the appearance and growth of a bubble. And in some other cases, it's when the bubble starts oscillating or changing its shapes because of driving pressure, which could be acoustic, or because the temperature is increasing or reducing. So the bubble also is changing its sizes.
And what I also gathered from the materials I was reading to prepare for it, very often actually the appearance of bubble is a nuisance. You're trying to do everything not to have them. And here you are saying like, I want the bubbles.
Indeed, I think bubbles are a messy subject in some fields, particularly in microfluidics. Sometimes people say bubbles is trouble, because when you have a small bubble inside a small channel and it clogs the channel, then your experiment stops. In some biomedical cases, bubbles in your bloodstream is not good because you could have problems in your brain or in some other cases. The challenge with bubbles is that no matter how careful you plan your experiments, they tend to appear even if you don't want them. And then instead of trying to avoid it at all costs, what I have been focusing for most of my professional career is agreeing that they will be there given the right circumstances. But if we learn how to mitigate or promote the appearance and the phenomena around bubbles, then we have a good tool to explore new science or to find novel applications that can help the human economical or health activities.
So what you said is that you're doing everything to avoid them, but then do you have actually control over them as more? Like, can you really create them easily, or is there also the problem? So the problem is that they appear when you don't want them, and also it's not so easy to have them.
Yeah, it depends on the bubble. Sometimes they will come up no matter what. If you take a dry glass and you pour some water, typically you will always get bubbles in small defects. So you don't need to work too hard for it. For example, if you empty the glass and put again more liquid, some of the bubbles will not be there anymore because the liquid already filled or made the surface wet. So if you have that type of knowledge, depending on the experiment that you want to have, more or less bubbles, then you can define your experiment much better. So it's not a question of not wanting them, it's to first understanding what makes them appear. And if you want to promote them or not, then you have different choices. So it's learning to live with bubbles and make them your friend instead of your enemy.
Okay, good. I mean, for children, for sure, as you said, so bubbles are friendly. Although it is, for me, it's always a cause of stress when the soap liquid runs out and they want to make bubbles that day. To be honest, it's just
that's
parent
true.
problems.
But you can still play a lot with liquid jets. So that's the magic of fluids, that they change so much that they don't stop fascinating humans. No matter, you have seen water dropping from the tap for years, and every time you open it, if you make some changes, everybody feels like interacting or playing with it.
Of course. I also recently saw some interesting videos by science communicators that I'll share also in the show notes, where they are making soap bubbles outside with these temperatures. It's just so beautiful to see what happens when they start freezing, right? It is fascinating for sure.
That's another thing I wanted to add about fluids, is that the interfaces, like a bubble, you have that interface. In an analogy of what we started the conversation, why it's so enriching to work with other experts from different fields is that the interfaces of knowledge, interesting things happen. And the same is with bubbles or fluid jets. So I'm not surprised that we will remain fascinated by fluid interfacial phenomena for centuries.
Yes, and moreover, there are great applications we can talk about here. So let's look at those. But before we do that, you prepared an interesting pub quiz question for our listeners that is related to the topic of our conversation later on. And listeners, remember the solution to this question only at the end of the podcast.
Yeah, the question I have for the listeners is how long does it take for your skin to renew? Is it a matter of weeks, days, years?
All right, weeks, days, years. Don't Google. Wait for the end of the podcast. You can get the answer. We will be talking a little bit about it. And that means we're looking at skin. And I have to say, today in the morning when I woke up, I was actually thinking that skin is such an important part of our body. But when I looked at it, I was like, okay, I see an arm. I see my hand. You don't think of what is actually this arm or this hand covered with, right? Skin is not something we are really consciously thinking of on a daily basis.
I'm very happy that you put the question that way. I'm trained as a nuclear engineer, so I never thought about skin as an interesting or important organ. But it's not only the largest organ in the human body, but it's again an interface between the outside and the inside. So it's what keeps us as a bubble. Our inner organs is something that I assume we knew everything about it, because if you Google or whatever, you find a lot of information about skin, many commercial products to improve your skin appearances, or creams to help during dry seasons, medicines. And the interesting thing is that at the micro scale, there are a lot of questions that remain to be answered. So we know a lot about color, or how it deforms when you press with a finger, or how powerful a bullet needs to be to go through. So that's a negative type of information if you want. However, there's so much that we still don't know about the skin at that micro scale that we were just discussing. At the cellular level, a few micrometers, a few millimeters even, is a universe that I'm just learning more and more in the last 10 years.
Okay, so you will be the source of knowledge for our listeners today. First of all, about the layers. Can you tell us a little bit about the layers? What do we have there?
Yes, so typically you have an outer layer which is very good at protecting us. So for, the evolution, Mother Nature has given us one of the most perfect defense mechanisms. So there are typically three main layers, and the upper one we see is typically dead cells. But then as you go deeper, it becomes to be more interesting, depending on the body part. So from the palms or the plant of your feet is very different than from your knee or your neck or your ear. And there tends to be a combination of different molecules. You have proteins, you have different type of cells. You have cells that are there to give some sort of protection from mechanical bruising. Also for thermal isolation, you have cells that have more fat. And then very soon you start getting small vessels from the blood circulation that ensure that you bring nutrients to the cells, but also from a thermal management, you keep the body temperature and, the conditions inside your organs or your body as stable as possible in response to the changing environment. So it's a very complicated engineering system.
Okay, great. It reminds me also of a discussion I had with engineers about the skin deformation during surgeries, that they were kind of making some simulation models for surgeons so that it was actually for breast cancer patients, to see where the surgeons should be actually operating, which is very interesting because, of course, you see engineering, you lay perspective, you think building, bridge, right? And then when you say engineering skin, it's completely like you don't have a feeling that this is an interface, but as you're saying, it is. And there come bubbles as well. So what's the connection of the bubbles and the skin, and what are you doing actually?
Yeah, that's a nice journey that I have been enjoying over the last 12 years approximately. During my PhD, I looked at making bubbles with ultrasound, but then we learned that with lasers, looking at the literature, and also I had a guest visit my lab, with increasing the temperature in a liquid, you can also create a bubble. And that is important because if you can locally create bubbles, that interface that appears can grow in such a fast way that if you then confine that bubble to a small channel, and that channel has a liquid, when the bubble grows, it can push the liquid at high velocities. And these jets, or these liquid jets, when the liquid is expelled at high velocities, can be controlled in size with different type of velocities. And we start looking at possibilities of using that mechanism of bubble-generated jets to see if we could penetrate human tissue, in particular skin, without damaging it. That is the shortest connection.
The first challenge I see is the splashback, I guess, when you're trying to get in. So the problem of all the liquid not getting in, right?
Yeah, that is one notorious known fact about trying to inject liquid jets into skin. Already halfway the previous century, technologies that were decided or defined already even in the 19th century to inject without needles were tried with different technologies. Instead of using lasers, like I just explained, compressed springs or compressed gas have been used as energy sources to propel liquid, or also powders to try to inject into the skin. But as you say, if the velocity is too high, or if you're trying to put too much liquid in one point, eventually you start splashing back. So that is a very interesting engineering challenge to figure out how much liquid can you shoot at the skin, in which velocity range, and how soon should you stop to avoid the splashback, but ensure that you have injected the liquid that you need, for example, for a medical treatment like a vaccine or injecting insulin.
But for the context, as you're saying, this technology of doing it needle-free is not new. So, except for Star Trek, of course, let's not talk science fiction in this case. In general, that has been used, just not the one that you're talking about.
Exactly, and that's what I tried to explain at the beginning. Innovation, or an engineer sometimes looks in the past what has been done. Many scientists also do it. Before you publish a paper or try to demonstrate an experiment, you need to look in the literature, and you typically figure out that other people have tried different things. So the first patent about needle-free injection is from a French inventor from the 19th century. So that was never used. And in the 20th century, different approaches were explored. As I said, compressed spring, compressed gas, solenoids, like some electromagnetic movement of a big bodies to push a plunger and then the liquid is expelled. Even lasers were studied more than 20 years ago, and you can see lasers used in medicine. For example, for eye surgeries, sometimes the laser creates a bubble inside the eye to then destroy or change conditions inside the tissue. However, the new element that we've been bringing with my research group and collaborators around the world is diode lasers, which are much smaller than the traditional lasers that you see in technology or medical and cosmetic installations. And these diode lasers not only are less expensive, but they are smaller, so it allows us to combine it with microfluidic chips into an integrated device. And we have all of a sudden the ability to inject small droplets with a lot more control than the traditional jet injectors that try to inject, for example, 1 ml or half a milliliter into the skin in one injection. What we are proposing is a paradigm shift in the sense that instead of trying to inject in one go, we use many little droplets trying to enter through the tissue without damaging, but having the same expected result.
So it doesn't mean that it's a kind of a beam or I don't know how to call it that goes together. It's just droplets that you are actually aiming at the skin.
We can play with both. So sometimes you have a little droplet, but a droplet in itself, the mass or the inertia it carries is relatively limited. Imagine how we print paper, the inkjet printers we have at home or at the office. Typically, they are very well-defined droplets, but the velocity is typically 3 meters per second. So these tiny droplets of a few picoliters are very well defined to impact the paper and give you nice resolution. But we can make much longer droplets, or jets in that case. So let's say that a droplet is a jet where the radius and the length are the same. The moment that you start making these longer droplets or jets, they carry more mass and more inertia. It's having a train. So when you have a long train, when it hits the tissue, it has more power to go in between the cells composing the tissue.
So I see another challenge, and the challenge is how deep inside the skin can it go? And is it enough?
That is indeed the ultimate challenge. I tell when I'm giving my lectures, I say, what do you think is the biggest challenge for this technology to work? And well, some people say it's the laser, the energy, consumption, cost. It would be too expensive to commercialize it. And all of those are part of the challenge, of course, but the ultimate challenge is our skin. Because our skin is very different in the summer, in the winter, if we are older or younger, or if we consume alcohol or not. So we need to develop parallel technologies to the injection promise, so that we might need to know a priori what are the properties of this specific part of the skin, so that a computer could adjust and say, well, I need to shoot with this velocity, this number of jets or this number of droplets to reach then a given depth and measure your injection has been successful. So that technology, we have been doing progress, trying to build puzzles of the whole picture, but it's still a challenge to put it all together.
Of course. And I have to ask, let me be the devil's advocate, why bother? I mean, we have the needles.
That is a question that I had to answer myself a few times before deciding to enter this field, because indeed needles are already very effective in many treatments, and I'm not trying to replace all needles in the world, but there are a few elements that have convinced funding agencies and team members to join my efforts. The first one is that many people are afraid of needles. It's actually a clinical condition. Needles can cause pain. And imagine if you have to inject regularly because of a chronic disease, if you could avoid the needle altogether, that is also a benefit for patients. Doctors and nurses, no matter how well trained they are, every now and then they prick their fingers, and that can bring risk of infectious diseases. Additionally, after a needle has been used, you need to dispose it properly. You cannot just throw it in the normal trash. You need to treat it. And there's a lot of ecological contamination, and the footprint of the needle-associated procedures is huge. When you consider medical, but also cosmetic procedures, the amount of needles is estimated, even before the pandemics, to be about 44 million needles used every day. And that is an underestimate. So all those are things to make a case against the needle. But the ultimate evidence we're trying to build is that you could inject more efficiently where it's really needed, saving drugs, also limiting the risk of side effects of many drugs. Because when you inject locally the right amount, you avoid, for example, having to swallow a pill and having the drug circulating through your whole body. Or some of the creams that are out there, sometimes they are not very effective because our skin, as I said earlier, protects us very well from the outside world. So we need to work together with skin. Instead of trying to punch through and making a hole, we try to understand how skin behaves, how skin gets softer, or how can we push the drugs or the liquids in a friendlier way than to smashing it with a sharp, long needle.
And also, so we have chronic diseases management, we have vaccines, and we have to take the elephant out of the room or whatever, tattoos, but especially medical tattoos, right?
Yeah, that's exactly where I started this research. When I didn't have enough funding to do more fancy studies, I reached out to colleagues that had a tattoo.
You don't have one?
Meeting. No, I don't have one myself, but I know many colleagues and many people who have it. The stigma is changing. A lot of people are accepting the fact that tattoos should not be only associated with the mafia or the sailors or the underworld. It's becoming actually has been in human activity for more than 5,000 years. In Italy, they found a mummy a few years ago with some areas of tattoos, which are obviously not to show, the name of your favorite sport club or the name of a beloved one. It's actually indicating areas where treatments of some type of disease, which could be joint pain, using pigments that are known to have pharmaceutical effect. So tattoos have not only been used for medical purpose in history, but as a form of art and expression of belonging. In the tribes in the Pacific Islands, it's kind of a traditional procedure. And nowadays you see many survivors of cancer tattooing together after, mother-daughter or spouses, so can bind. And I think it's a beautiful manifestation of bringing art to your own skin, but it has to be a natural choice and also understanding the risk. Because what has been known is that the type of ink you use can have serious effects on your health. Luckily, the European Union has made progress in trying to establish which pigments are safe or not. However, what I have been focusing the most is, can we bring the inks that are the safest in a better, more efficient way to the skin without damaging, without creating wounds? And I have learned to love that elephant in the room, as you said. Instead of hiding it, it's like, let's look at it, because if humans have been doing it for millennia, let's make it safer. Let's try to understand better how else can it help humanity.
And is it actually, from an engineering perspective, injecting ink and injecting a drug different, or that would be similar droplets?
Yes and no. So from a system point of view, the technology would look more or less the same. So you would have energy source to put the ink or the drug in motion, and then it would enter tissue. It could be the skin, could be also internal organs. For example, you mentioned medical tattoos has been used to redraw the nipple after a breast cancer, but also has been used during radiotherapy to mark the points where the tumor is, so that the technician knows after a few weeks where exactly the radiotherapy should be aimed at. However, depending on the type of ink, you might have different pigments with different particle sizes. The fluid properties are very different than, say, a vaccine. So you need to adjust some of these systems and the microfluidic components to make sure that you get the right velocity and the right size of jets.
So loads of challenges in the end.
I love that. That's why I'm so passionate about my work.
And that's why you also like probably entrepreneurship as such, because I have to say that in our podcast, we don't often have researchers or scientists who also crossed the Rubicon or whatever you want to call it, right? And decided to become an entrepreneur. Do you think all of the researchers should try that? Should try to become an entrepreneur?
I wish everybody would have this question for themselves. The answer is that not everybody needs to be an entrepreneur, but everybody should understand how important it is to respect those who make the jump, the challenges, and if not help, at least not put obstacles in the way. Because maybe a few years ago, that a professor would be busy with entrepreneurial activities will be seen as a wrong thing to do, because science should be pure and respond only to nature and curiosity. But if you look in history, almost all important discoveries that come from fundamental scientists came from a motivation of solving a practical problem. So it's not incompatible. I do agree that the way to answer questions from a fundamental point of view are different than trying to solve a practical problem. But if you don't want to be the entrepreneur and you have a brilliant idea and it stays only in your head or in a patent or in an article, that doesn't guarantee that it's going to be used by society. And I think that we have a moral mission that if we have learned something with taxpayers' money and it only stays in the academic records, who is going to bring that knowledge to society? Sometimes companies don't even know of the existence of brilliant Professor X that made a discovery. So there are different ways to make sure that that knowledge is brought to society. Sometimes you have already a company that knows, and then you can transfer the knowledge. But sometimes you need to take the challenge and bring that knowledge a bit outside of the walls of the university. And that's what I find interesting from the academic entrepreneurship point of view, that you might not be the CEO, but you need to understand and empathize with the different stakeholders, not only the ultimate user of the technology, if it's a patient, but also who's going to sell your technology, who's going to pay for it. Is it going to be the patient family, or can the insurance company or the insurance system somehow pay for it? And that, I think, is a duty we have as well. I can come up with hundreds of great ideas, but what is going to determine that those ideas are going to change or improve life on our planet?
But at the same time, I have a quote from you that says, entrepreneurship should be seen in a broader context than just creating a company or developing products or services purely for profit. And what you said is actually look into the profit, didn't you?
Not necessarily. I think profit is not a negative thing depending on how you put it. Traditionally, entrepreneurial activities have been associated with creating a company and becoming rich. But I argue that it's just a fraction of the whole movement. There are people who were already rich and they are still entrepreneur, not because of the money, but because of the passion or the kick you get by seeing your inventions being used in society. You can be also an intrapreneur or innovate within an existing company or organization. And I know also many cases where people are doing, their own companies and it's not for the profit. So it's not mutually exclusive. It's a traditional way of looking at entrepreneurship that we're trying to change to make it more sustainable, more eco-friendly, but also friendlier to our human fellows. And this is what I'm trying to educate also my students and the team of people working with me.
And this is also what you can read in your book, right? So we will share the link in the show notes of the book if you want to know more. Exactly. Empathy, entrepreneurship, there is all of it there. Also avoiding or not avoiding risks and things like that. But because in Silex we are jumping from one country to another country, it's also probably interesting for the listeners to see how it is to do science, or in your case, actually be an entrepreneur and do science in this country, except instead of that country. So how do you see the Netherlands and University of Twente? I know that it used to have this motto of being the innovation university, right?
The entrepreneurial university.
Exactly.
Yes. Well, I'm happy you make this question because I was trained in Cuba in a socialist period where, entrepreneurship was not even a word that you will hear in the university. And the same happened to me when I started my PhD in the Netherlands. I was not even aware about the motto of the university. I was biking under the banner almost every day. And only towards the end of my PhD, I realized, hey, I have a lot of interesting knowledge that could be applied in society. How can I bring this knowledge further? And then slowly I start talking to colleagues around me, and I identified that our university has a knowledge transfer office. I discussed with my friend and lab mate, which we had a few papers together, if it made sense to do a Friday afternoon experiment to check if with our bubbles we could clean contact lenses. The results were positive. Then we talked to our professors back then. Is this something we could explore? oh yeah, sure, talk to the knowledge transfer office. We applied for a patent, we applied for small funding from the Dutch government, and then we created my first spin-off company, BubClean, using ultrasound and bubbles to improve processes to clean objects, but also the semiconductor and fabrication technology. That already illustrates how the Netherlands is a good place for a foreigner, a nuclear engineer, to start a business coming from a fundamental scientific research. And the company still stands today. We are commercializing bubble bags worldwide. And later on, the company has its own path, but I joined as faculty member, and I had this other idea of injecting without needles into the skin. And now I'm having a very different path because, of course, the ultimate promise of injecting without needles resonates a lot more with funding agencies, with sustainable goals. And now we have, again, my second spin-off company called Flowbeams, which we are very excited to have made great progress. And, it's a commercial story in itself. And I can still teach my students how that entrepreneurial drive can make beautiful scientific discovery be useful for society. So I think the Netherlands and Europe in general is an amazing place. We still have some things to improve, but I think the European Commission is taking the right steps in the right direction so far.
And as you mentioned, the European Commission, there is also one more thing to our story, actually, because we met at the EU Research and Innovation Days, right?
Yes.
In Brussels, exactly. So, with the ERC grants and the Horizon grants and all that, that is important part of the story, of course, and the discussion has to go on with Choose Europe as such. Let's be positive. Okay, so what remains is probably, one thing only, except for going back to work and getting another spin-off company maybe for you and for me on the interview probably later on, is to solve the pub quiz question. I'm sure listeners, you're all waiting impatiently to get it solved. So David, if you can remind us what the question was and then give us the answer.
Certainly. How frequently you think your skin renews, if it's a matter of a week, or days or months. And the answer is a bit vague because, as I said earlier, skin is very different. But depending on your age and the environment around you, it takes about 28 to 34 days for a new layer of skin to pop out. So typically our skin is growing. We don't really see it. But if you realize that, as I said before, our upper layers of the skin is dead cells, it means that from within or under the skin, there are some cells busy all the time producing new cells, and they slowly make their way up. So this is an interesting demonstration of how important is our skin, because it's always working for us. We just have to treat it better, so we should protect it, we should pay more attention, and definitely we need to learn more about each of us skin, but all of us as a whole.
Yes, and this is a very good way to wrap up. I will only add that I know that you organized a series of events called Under Our Skin. I don't know if it's going to continue, but watch this space. If you're in the Netherlands, go check out so you know more about the skin and you pay more attention.
Definitely. What I say is that there's a future under our skin.
Exactly.
There's a lot to exploit, and we can do it together.
Exactly. And the bubbles. Don't forget the bubbles.
Of course.
Thank you, David, so much for today.
A pleasure. Thanks for your questions.
And this is it for today. Don't forget to subscribe, to follow us, to check out what we're writing on all the social media, check other episodes. There's a lot to explore, more than 100 episodes waiting for you. This was Silax, and my name is Hanna Siemaszko.